All right, well, thanks once again for joining me here at Pastor's Positive Mental Health Institute. As you see, I have two wonderful, beautiful people joining me today, which is really exciting because this is kind of a direction I've been wanting to go, is to get some couples involved, but also pastors' wives. But we have a special dynamic duo, I guess we should call that here. But if you like the content, please share, like, and subscribe, and we'll just dive right into it. So I have with me Tim and Kristin Niekerk. Did I say that correctly?
Well, my family can't even agree. My dad has 7 brothers and sisters, so half of them say Niekerk, some of them have to say Niekerk, but I grew up as Niekerk. But whatever you want to call me,
that's fine. I just like the last 4 letters.
Right,
love it.
Right.
Yeah, and I looked that up. It's like someone who lives next to a new church.
Mm-hmm.
So there you go. You see, because my name in Scottish is church, and so if you ever read a theology book about from Scotland, you hear my name all over the place. So it's whenever I feel down, right? So let's just dive right in. So we'll start with you, Tim. Just tell us a little bit about yourself, and I really like to look at the journey of how you got into ministry.
Yeah, I would. So I grew up in a lifelong Lutheran home, baptized as a baby, grew up in Lutheran schools. I like to joke that I bleed Lutheran. My great-grandfather was a Lutheran pastor. Quite frankly, I had no interest in going into ministry. I love to build things, love to design things. All of that is really kind of one of my passions in life. And what's been interesting is God's given me an opportunity to scratch that itch in quite a number of ways, even going into ministry. So I went into college. My goal in college was to prove to everybody that I could make it in business. So I was taking accounting and economics and law and all those kinds of classes. And over the course of my first 2 years at Concordia University in Mequon, Wisconsin, I kept having people go, "Hey, Tim, have you ever considered going into ministry?" To which, of course, I would go, "No." Or yes, but no, So at any rate, over a period of time, people who poured into me that had significant influence in my life just kept pressing me. God did his thing. And so finally, my junior year, I decided to use my electives to take Greek and Hebrew. So you can imagine, as all of a sudden this guy who's in the business school is suddenly taking Greek and Hebrew, and these guys are looking at me like, who does that for their electives?
Right.
Right. So I took them and actually found that I enjoyed Hebrew more than Greek. Anyway, decided, hey, God, it was my own fleece opportunity, Kirk, in many ways, of saying, God, if you want me to go into ministry, then I don't want to just sort of limp my way in. I'd like you to demonstrate this is what you're calling me to do. And for whatever reason, God's given me a mind that memorizes reasonably quickly. And I found that languages were a lot of memorization. And so I caught up pretty quickly, and the rest is history. I ended up going to Concordia Seminary, St. Louis, got called to a funeral home with 14 people, planted a church, started an early childhood center, started a high school, and then Salem found me in 2006. Came in as the connections guy, which is basically small group assimilation guy. Eventually became the executive pastor and became senior pastor here, following a guy that had been the senior pastor for 36 years back in 2013. So that's my journey to ministry, where I'm at today.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. And again, it's one of those things that is really important that I like to call out and note, is that other people mention it and they see it in you, and they say, hey, have you considered this? And another thing that actually we're learning, so Dr. Chris Adams is kind of looking at this from Biola, and he and I were talking, and it's one of those things that we're looking at, how those who are sustained in ministry typically grew up in the church and had people that were pouring into them and saying, hey, I kind of see this in you. And they seem to sustain a little longer. Some of my theory is because they understand church culture a little bit already. And so they're not so shocked and surprised when they come in and people can be the way that they are. So what's, really quick before we get into Kristin, what's the name of the church that you're at right now?
I'm at Salem Lutheran Church in Tomball, Texas. Tomball is in the northwest, probably third outer ring of the Houston suburbs. In many ways, wouldn't want to be considered part of Houston, but the reality is they are. So,
well, it's like I'm in El Paso, and we don't want to be part of Mexico or New Mexico, but we're somehow part of Texas. So but we're not in the
Right.
Texas district, which is weird. So that's a whole different.
That is very weird.
Yeah, we're Rocky Mountains, so we're just kind of where are we going to put El Paso? Well, so I think Texas said you guys can have them. I'm not sure. So anyway,
Gotcha.
it's a great place to be. So Kristen, this is and thanks. We're probably done with you, Tim. No, I'm just kidding. But
Understand. She's the better looking one anyways.
one of the things that I'm looking to do too, and this is great, is to talk to pastors' wives. And so I might ask you for a future interview, just so you know. But so you are not only a pastor's wife, you're also, if I understand this right, you're a director of Christian education, right?
No,
No, you're not.
I'm
Okay.
not. No,
Okay.
I'm a licensed professional counselor.
Okay. Even better, right? Which is
Yes.
where we're going. So kind of tell me your journey. We know Tim's journey, but tell me your journey to get into your counseling.
Well, my mom in high school joked and used to call me the social worker because I was always the one that everybody came to with their problems and some like really heavy stuff. Like my best friend went through some really heavy stuff. And so just walking that journey with her in college and things like that. But kind of the same as Tim, like I'm not going to be a counselor. And so that's not what I want to do. So I was going to be a special ed teacher and went to Concordia, Mequon. That's where we met. Sat through my first education class and had that moment of, oh no, no, nope. Fine. I'll just be a counselor. And so I went into my counseling classes, my psychology classes. I'm actually dyslexic, so school has never been easy for me. I've had to work really hard and it's been really frustrating and difficult. And the minute I started taking my psychology classes, it was literally the first time I got a 4.0 ever. Like I loved the classes. I did really well in them and the material made sense to me. And so I didn't do the fleecing like Tim did, but I felt like that was kind of the confirmation of like, no, this is where I want you. This is what you're supposed to be. This is the plans I have for you. And then I did an undergraduate internship at a residential psychiatric hospital. I'm a certified eating disorder therapist, and I'm also certified in EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's used for trauma. And I got introduced to the world of eating disorders through that internship. Again, wasn't my plan, fell into it. And then when
you also had a friend in high school that dealt with it.
Yeah, I did have a good friend in high school that dealt with an eating disorder and actually almost died. Then when he was in seminary, obviously I was the breadwinner. So I put my education on hold, started my master's degree his last year, so the credits would transfer, and then finished my master's degree once we were placed in Milwaukee. So that's kind of my journey.
Yeah. Well, when you go to best practices, I think they encourage a certain type of eating disorder. Okay. Anyway, so.
So Kirk, I would so that's how she got into counseling. Then she in essence had some of her own counseling that she did when she was in Milwaukee. Then she also worked with two clinics, the one where she started her internship and then another lady that she worked for. Then in 2006, when we moved to Tomball, Texas, she took a little bit of time off. Our kids at that point were 1 and 5. So she took a couple of years off as we got settled into Tomball. And then she took a giant leap when she got down here and started her own practice called Pathway Counseling Services. And man, that has just continued to, it started out as something that she was doing relatively part-time, but now she is in a spot where she's been doing that, goodness, for probably the last 16, 17 years. And so she's pretty established in Northwest Houston as a Christian counselor, as an EMDR counselor, as an eating disorders counselor. And then she's got an area that she's really opened up. Our district uses her, and a number of churches in the area use her in the area of church trauma. So she's got her own practice in the area, and I'm super proud of her, and she's doing a great job.
Well, that's good. And so we're going to lean into some of the things that she has dealt with, but we're going to kind of center this around, as pastors and church leaders, we rely upon church members. I know we don't like to think that we need to, but without church members, we don't have a church, right? So, Tim, can you kind of tell me how over the years you've relied on church members?
Yeah, I think so. My initial entry into ministry was 14 people in a funeral home. So I was part of a church plant. So in many ways, all I had was a couple of people. I was brand new community. So I would say some of those early people, you just leaned on for all kinds of things. And then as the years have gone on, Kirk, I think some of the challenges for both Kristin and me, I'll speak for myself, has been trying to figure out how you balance the fact that it's not always an even playing field.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I'm probably a bit more careful after 10 plus years of counseling of my own, walking through my own church trauma,
Mm-hmm.
walking through some pretty heavy stuff over the years. You can imagine following a guy that's been in a place for 36 years and inheriting a team. There's a whole, and this church is 174 years old. So
Yeah.
I joke sometimes that I lead the firm, and I joke that we have our own cemetery, and I'm lucky that I'm not buried in it yet. But the point being is I think over the years, I've leaned on people for leadership, for support, for encouragement within the ministry. I think I've tried over the years to have some closer friendships, and then over time, I think I've had to get a little bit careful about how much you open up and how much you don't. And so through counseling, I think I've gotten to a much better place as to creating safe boundaries for myself, both emotionally and spiritually and physically. And that's been really helpful. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question.
No, that's great. And I think that's what's interesting is that what I'm hoping people are hearing is it's okay for pastors to seek counseling. And in fact, I really would encourage churches to kind of have a line item budget for that.
I agree with you 100%.
That would be the goal.
Yeah.
Because a lot of pastors, as I'm sure, as we'll talk to Kristin, just reject the idea of counseling. I was in a tradition before I came into the LCMS that just rejected any counseling altogether. It was just pastors and the Bible. I mean, that was enough. And I would get into trouble because I'd refer people, because there were times I was just like, this is way beyond my ability. I think God's word and a pastor can do a lot. But that's the surface stuff, right? There's some deep issues that often in a safe environment, still with godly counsel, need to be dealt with. And so I'm hoping that we get there. I mean, it helps that you have a counselor as a spouse. I know, although she's not counseling you, but I think that she can encourage you to go get counseling, and you might.
But she tries.
But it took me a while, honestly, like early on. Every marriage has its up and downs. And so, in one of the more down moments, it took me a while to get him to be willing to go see a counselor, for both of us, but even do his own work. And like, he was able to eventually get past that and has like really engaged, and has worked really hard in lots of different areas, and myself. So you're right. It's so important. And I think it's so vital, but there really is that the stigma has come so far, but yet there's still other areas where it's still there, big and bright.
Yeah. Well, It's interesting. At the last Synod conference, they kind of had this whole one of the overtures, resolutions that was passed was a little more attention to the mental health of pastors and church workers. So I'm waiting, right? But I know that LCEF and Concordia Plans, and many of these are really trying to help out with that. And Concordia Plans has added, more counseling sessions to what they provide. But anyway, so when we look at this dynamic between church members and pastors, Kristin, I wonder if you can speak to, and you can I'm sure you've leaned into church trauma. I'm
Mhm.
sure you've leaned into both, I'm assuming both pastors and church members.
Yep.
So as far as pastors go, what have you seen as some of the biggest challenges that pastors are dealing with?
I think some of it is the context that they're in. Depending. So my work with the district of Texas district, I'm allowed to, in my licensing, I'm allowed to see anybody in Texas. And so the one good thing that came from COVID is telehealth.
Right.
And just people's willingness, everybody's used to it. So I've seen pastors and pastors' wives and church workers all over the state of Texas, some in tiny little towns, and then obviously, Houston, one of the biggest cities in the country. And so some of it is context, some of the guys or spouses, they're in these tiny little towns. They don't have access to a lot. They don't have a lot of support. There's a lot of loneliness. They're on this little island all by themselves. But then you have other people who are in large churches. And so I think what I've experienced personally and in working with people is just trying their best to balance the expectations that people have of who they are, how much time they spend in ministry, in really just like the work-life balance. Especially, I see younger pastors really struggling with that more. And I think part of that is not to look at it too business-y, but at the same time, like they're carving their career path. And so they really struggle with those boundaries because ministry, it can eat your lunch. Like somebody can want you and need you at all times. They have access to you at all times. And so that is really hard for people to figure out where those boundaries are, where that balance is of course you want to be with somebody when they need help, but at the same time not at sacrificing your own self-care or your relationship with your families. So those are some of the really big ones that I see that we work a lot on. And then just kind of some of the trauma that happens from people's expectations. And sadly, like there's just sometimes there isn't a filter, there isn't a stop sign that goes up in people's heads saying, maybe I shouldn't verbalize this. The things that people say to pastors and church workers and their families, like there's times where I really don't understand. Like I would not say that to somebody that I hated.
Yeah.
And so just dealing with the lack of appropriate conversation, willingness to have conversations versus what feels like an attack.
Yeah. Well, and Tim kind of mentioned it, and he talked about years. He's learned years of ministry experience plus counseling. He's learned to set some boundaries. And you come out of seminary, and you come into the ministry, and you're young and you're excited to be part of the helping profession that pastors are, and they just want to help. They want to serve the kingdom. They want to see the kingdom grow. And so we find ourselves easily, and then on top of it, we're very insecure. Pastors are insecure people. They want everyone to like them. They're people pleasers, and we have to recognize that. And so we look at our work-life balance and say, well, I'm paid to be on call all the time. And then in smaller congregations and in smaller rural areas, that those lines can get really blurred, right? As you mentioned. One of the things that when I do presentations to pastors or to church leaders is we talk about the ambiguous job expectations and then unrealistic expectations that people have. And the reality is that people don't realize that their expectation is unrealistic, and they don't
Mhm.
realize that that expectation is there until the pastor doesn't meet it. And then
Right.
now it's emotionally charged, and they can't step back and go, was this really a fair expectation? I've had
Yeah.
more than one pastor have a congregation member mad at them that they didn't visit them in the hospital, but the pastor never knew they were in the hospital. And it's like, and then seriously, one of them told the pastor, well, you're supposed to have a direct line to God. You should have known. And it's like,
Wow.
and you're saying that, well, that's just unrealistic. And
Yeah,
if you,
that's not rational.
right, and if you could really step back, I think when you're not in a moment of emotion or pain or whatnot, and think, is that fair? Right? I think they could say it's not, but again, so we see this working with pastors and church leaders. What would be and you can chime in, Tim, anytime. I know that you are happy to let Kristen talk here, but what would be kind of just one thing that you would say to pastors that is the one thing that all pastors need to really kind of set as a routine to protect themselves mentally and emotionally?
Ooh, that one thing to set as a routine. I'm gonna let you go first because I want to think about that for a second.
So I have two things that kind of immediately come to mind, Kirk. So I don't know if I can get it down to one,
That's fine.
but I think to your point, when you come out of seminary and you're going into ministry, most people don't go into ministry because they hate people.
Right.
I mean, that just doesn't make sense, right? So you go into ministry because you feel called. You want to make a difference both in this life and for the life to come. You want to make kingdom impact. So I think there's unfortunately some naivety that you come out with, that you're going to go love people and people are going to be grateful for the fact that you do your best to love them. And then life does what life does, and everybody doesn't respond well. People have crazy expectations, like I'm supposed to know you're in the hospital, even though nobody told me. People call me at all hours of the night. I had no boundaries early on, particularly in the day and age that young men are coming out into ministry now. The level of access that people have to us because of our phones is staggering. I mean, I didn't have that when I initially came out in '97, but I certainly have it now. I'm trying to retake back some of those boundaries at moments. So I would say number one, it's setting boundaries early,
Mhm.
and not harsh boundaries, but clear boundaries.
And
So
maintain them.
I would say things like absolutely protecting a day off. I find it funny that in ministry, sometimes churches act like it is crazy train that we might take 2 days off in a week. And it's like, okay, how many of you take 2 days off in a week? So, but to at the very least protect one day off a week. I recognize that looking back, I would always interrupt that. There was always a reason to interrupt it. And so I allowed myself to get to empty. So there would be my other point. You cannot let yourself get to empty. Once you get to empty, I've made it there one time in my life, and it nearly knocked me out of ministry, probably almost cost me my marriage, my family, my ministry, all of it. And that comes from just making yourself immensely accessible to people at all times, all places. So here would be if I had to narrow it down to one thing, I would say define for yourself what is really an emergency. Because I'll tell you what, at this point in my life, I'll give you an example, Kirk. I had a guy call me within the last, I don't know, 6 to 12 months, had my cell phone, because a lot of people have my cell phone. Great. But I cut some boundaries on that pretty hard. I won't just respond to people whenever. And look, he had been found out that he had done something really dumb, had been doing something really dumb. His wife was ready to throw him out of his house. He was pretty convinced he was probably getting a divorce. And, you don't need to know all the details how that whole thing turned out. But this guy was losing his mind and wanted me to drop everything on Friday evening and meet him. And I mean, Kirk, I just responded to the guy and said, so let's say it's you. I basically said, hey, Kirk, love you, brother. I know this is a challenging time. My suggestion would be go get yourself a hotel so that everybody can have a little bit of space. I'll be in my office starting 8 o'clock on Monday. I've got availability at 10, 1, and 2:30 or something like that. And I'd be happy to chat with you then. Mm-hmm. And I just left it at that and said, I'll be praying for you.
Yeah.
And my point was, in my own mind, because somebody might be listening to this right now going, holy smokes, Tim, like, do you not care? No, I care. But guess what? This guy wasn't dying. He had been an idiot. There was a reason why his wife was upset with him. Mm-hmm. I gave him some good advice, which was give both of you some space for the weekend, take a breather, and we're not going to solve this thing tonight. You've created a problem, and I'm happy to chat with you on Monday. But learning, I can guarantee you, Kirk, that when I was 25 coming out of seminary, I would have dropped everything on Friday, gone, met that guy, probably would have been gone for 3 hours. Mm-hmm. Who knows?
Right.
And probably would have eaten up my Saturday and my Sunday and would have still met with him on Monday, and I would have just given him immense access to me, would have jumped in like nobody's business. And now I'm to a point of I've got much stronger boundaries, and my definition of an emergency would be, now, if a family member calls me and says, hey, Tim, my son was just in a car accident, is being life flighted to Memorial Hermann downtown. Is there any way? Yes. Yeah. We don't know if that kid's going to live. That's an emergency. Mm-hmm. I'm jumping in on that one, or somebody on my team's jumping in on that one. And there also would be a boundary. Like if I'm not available, or I'm right in the middle of a anniversary celebration with my family, I have other people on my team. So willingness to be able to say, we will love you. It just might not be Tim Niekerk in this moment that is the person that's there. So I don't know if that helps.
No, that is, and you mentioned you're 25 out of seminary. And so that's kind of why I asked this question, is that how can we help these young pastors begin a pattern of protection? Because the reality is I had one pastor friend say to me, he goes, I like to tell people your lack of planning doesn't constitute my emergency. But the reality is, like, I had one guy that was in the hospital I didn't know, and he shows up to a midweek service, was during Lent, and he has a hospital bracelet on. He goes, yeah, I just got out and came over here for soup supper. And I'm like, you were in the hospital? He goes, yeah. I said, you should call me when you're in the hospital. I'd like to know. So then every time he called, I had to answer the phone. So sometimes it was a Saturday night, and he's like, hey, did you see the weather for tomorrow? And I'm like, oh man, why did I?
Yeah, well,
you just have to. And so sometimes I would just let it go to voicemail and just see if there was something because he would leave messages. But you have to find that balance, because it is subjective to individuals too. That's the thing we have to learn to navigate, is that some people you might want them to call you a little more because you're okay serving them. Other people, it's not such an emergency. And so when we look at that, I think one of the things that you mentioned is just using your expertise and your years of experience, that I'm hoping younger guys will listen to this. It helps me. I'm not younger, but it helps me go, okay, these are things I can help others understand better. And so, Kristin, we've given you enough time now to think about this. And so
I have my answer. Yeah.
What's a practice that a pastor can put in place?
I actually really think it's such a buzzword in my world, like really focusing on your self-care. Understanding who you are. And if you don't know who you are, then really please come to therapy, because we need to help you figure that out, because otherwise everybody's going to tell you who you are. But so figure out who you are, and the boundaries is part of self-care. It is too it is way too easy in ministry because it's ministry and you're dealing with people and dealing with crises and dealing with people's salvation and coming to know Jesus and all those things. It's so easy to put what we need to the side. And I'm not just talking about make sure that you get 8 hours of sleep and you brush your teeth and yes.
Floss. Gotta floss.
Floss.
The day before
Yes.
you go to the dentist, that's all.
Make sure you shower. Yes, those are our basic needs. But also part of self-care, God gave it to us. It's Sabbath. Like we need time off. We need time away. We need time to figure out what are the things that fill us up. Because ministry can be depleting. Ministry can also fill you up, but there's parts of ministry that also are depleting. And so, part of his story of, coming to empty is he literally did not have a hobby. Like he went to work and there was family. And so like we both had to really work at, okay, what are our hobbies? And he has hobbies now and I have hobbies. There's things that we do together. There's things that we do separately. And so it's figuring those things out. And honestly, I personally believe that part of self-care is your mental health, which includes counseling. I believe that every pastor, at a minimum, every pastor, I think church workers in general should be in counseling pretty much all the time. Just because of the weight of the expectations and things, the crises that are coming. I mean, you guys shoulder a lot. I'm a therapist, so I listen to trauma all day long. And by the time I'm done with the end of the day, I am depleted.
Mm-hmm.
Right now I have one counselor. I used to have 2 counselors for myself. I have a talk therapist who is also a senior pastor's wife from another denomination that's in Austin. She's not even in my area. She's a godsend. Literally, God dropped her in my lap. But then I also had an EMDR therapist to deal with some trauma that was happening in church trauma, ministry trauma that was happening in our life, but also just like life, family stuff. Our bodies absorb that. And we have to deal with that weight and that stress, or it literally affects our health. And so counseling is part of that. It's just as important as, going to the dentist, getting your eyes checked, going to the doctor when you're sick, going and getting the physical. Mental health and counseling is part of your self-care also. And if you don't have access, which nowadays, again, the good thing that came out of COVID, we have access to mental health services, but at a minimum, we need to have somebody that we can talk to. Now that gets a little dicey because I would say don't make that somebody in your congregation.
Right.
Right. So his closest buddies are all people in ministry, and none of them that I can think of off the top of my head there's one person in the Houston area, but Houston, it's an hour and a half to get across Houston. Everybody else is out of state. They talk a lot. There's a text thread a lot. They encourage each other. When we were going through a really, really difficult time and he was in ministry and he was on the verge of quitting ministry and I was begging him to quit ministry. One of those guys showed up on our front doorstep, literally, and sat down with us and sat down with him. So we need those people. But during that time, we also both had our own counselors that we were working with. It's part of self-care. And there's a disconnect there. People don't think of that as part of self-care. They think of self-care as the basics.
Right.
And this needs to be part of the basic. It's part of the foundation.
Well, to use this term, and some people might not like, but we're talking about holistic care. It's not just diet and exercise, right? Which are important too. When I was talking with Greg Walton from Grace Place Wellness, one of the things that I like to tell pastors is I like to use the word steward care, because self-care is weird for guys, right? For pastors.
Yeah.
Well, I can't be about self. And so I'm like, well, God's given you a congregation to steward, right? He's given you a family to be a steward of. He's also given you a body and a mind to be a steward of. So maybe we should take some care for that. But you mentioned something that I would like to dive into a little bit, because we see a lot of pastors struggling with identity, right? You said you have to know who you are, and they struggle with having outside activities, like you said, hobbies. And I've known personally some people who have tried to retire, but their identity is so wrapped up in pastoral ministry that they don't know what to do, because they don't have hobbies enough. And some of it is they've been in church situations, like you alluded to, that don't give them the opportunity to explore hobbies, don't encourage hobbies. Like, I encourage churches, if they can, find what their pastor likes to do and somehow support that, fund it, make them do it, right? And have people on the leadership team to say, hey, are you doing this, right? Or I haven't seen on your schedule that, for me, I like to golf. I haven't seen that you've golfed recently. For me, that's a huge mental health break. And it's great. And so I think that plus I roast coffee and all these other things. So it's one of these things that I can't wait to be retired, but I got but I think so. How would you encourage?
Me either.
Yeah. So how would you encourage pastors, especially those maybe who have been in ministry a while, to say how you need to kind of figure out who you are, and what you're going to be doing outside of ministry? What's some tips that you would give them? And since you've gone through it, Tim, you're welcome to chime in on this too. But
yeah, I would tell you one of the most telling moments for me when I kind of started counseling. First of all, I didn't want to go for a variety of reasons, all of which we probably touched on. Now I wouldn't not go. Like I would encourage any pastor listening to this, if you're fighting going to counseling, you're a moron, go to counseling. And if there was a way that I could get to the churches, one of the gifts I've been given from Salem is Salem, basically within reason, man. Like I would hope that I wouldn't abuse this, but has basically given me a blank check of, Tim, if you need to go to a counselor twice a week, go to a counselor. Like don't. There's a realization of the weight that I carry. So it's not just the weight that I carry, but it's also, so it's my own mental health for sure. But then think about all the stuff that's being placed on me, conversations that I'm having with people at any given moment. I mean, our staff is 135 people. There's always people in crisis around here, always. So or someone who's done something, whatever. So we're always in the middle of something. And so to have some place where I can go and process that. And what's interesting to me, for those that might be listening to this, is I've gotten to the point where I'm very leery of the person in the congregation that wants to be my sounding board, wants to be that person that, Tim, you've got to have somebody you can talk to. Probably early on in my ministry, I don't want to be pejorative here. I was going to say I fell for that. I don't think people, whatever. I think you got to be really careful of that, because I don't think somebody in the congregation needs to be the place where you go to talk about the fact that maybe Kristin and I are going through a tough time. Maybe I'm struggling with finding healthy ways to deal with my stress. I'm dealing with some situations on our staff. I'm dealing with whatever that may be. I think that's where having a professional counselor that you can go outside, or to get to my buddies that are literally outside of the state, has been really helpful. The other one that I would give, so then going back to where I started, which was kind of a critical moment for me in counseling, was when my counselor looked at me and said, Tim, what do you do to recharge? And you can't say spend time with your family, because if you don't do that, you're an idiot. And I went, and Kirk, I didn't have an answer, and didn't have an answer for a month. Like I would go in for my weekly session and be like, so what are you going to do? I didn't have an answer, and I didn't even know where to start. Like, it wasn't just I need to come up with a hobby. Because he just kept saying, because then he was trying to help me, right? So what kinds of things do you enjoy? Um, and I realized I had just poured myself into trying to do my job well and be a good husband and dad. And what was becoming painfully obvious to me was the fact that in my effort to try to do all those things well, I was failing at all of them. And then that was crashing down on me. And that's where I got to this pit that was nearly unsurvivable. And
You had
then
lost yourself.
and then to listen to Kristin talk about the whole idea of getting to know who you are, I had let too many voices speak into this. Um, you know, Tim, you're toxic. Tim, you're this. Tim, you're that. Tim, you're all the little buzzwords that might go around, because maybe I dealt with someone on staff. Maybe I didn't show up to the guy at the hospital. Maybe I didn't meet somebody's expectations. And so then the stuff starts to, and all these things are playing in your head. And to this day, man, like if I could give a pastor, if they're not going to go to counseling, then at least do this. Basically, my counselor over a period of weeks made me sit with him and figure out, Tim, who are you? And he just kept asking me that question, like, and then he would make me come up with stories to defend why I felt like that's who I was, to the point where, Kirk, I now, in the armrest of my car, it's handwritten, man. Like, this is old school as old school gets. It has 5 simple statements on it. And every once in a while, when I can just kind of feel myself, getting crushed by expectations, other people's statements about who I am, people declaring who I am, every once in a while, I bet it's about once a month, I'll sit in my car in the parking lot, open up that armrest, reread that list of 5 things and go, yep, that's me. Put it back in the armrest, and it's like I can kind of go, all right, let's go. Round 12. And I'm able to kind of step back in the ring with my head up, maybe a few stitches and blood coming off of my eyebrow or whatever, using that analogy. But with this calm, I would want to say humble confidence that this is who Tim Niekerk is. And it really doesn't matter to me if Kirk wants to say I'm this, that, or the other thing, because I know that's not true. But man, it took me, Kirk, I'm 53 now. I bet I finally had that list at 50. And I wish I would have had that list at 27.
Yeah. By the way, 53 is an awesome age, so good job. That's where I'm at too. So
we're kind of enjoying it. We just recently entered into empty nesting, and so
we started early, so we've been empty nesters for 8 years now. So
wow. Yeah.
Grandkids. That's one of the pluses of moving to El Paso was we have 2 grandkids down here, and
nice.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
And our son's in ministries and across town in a different denomination, but it's just a joy. And I can play golf year round here, which is a big deal, because I was in Idaho before, and that doesn't happen year round. So Tim, thank you so much. I mean, that's such good stuff. I think, Kristin, I'm sure you could kind of add to that, is what are some strategies for pastors to go, okay, and I think, so God tells us, or we encourage people as pastors, read the word. And why do we read the word? I mean, I've read it before, right? But I need to be reminded often. And so here's some strategies you have in the console of your car, right? I'm going to lift it up. These are strategies that I'm reminding, and I need to reference it often, because this is who I am. I had one pastor tell me once when I was going through some trouble, he goes, Kirk, you need to be satisfied with the fact that you're a child of God. Not that you're a pastor, not that you're these other things, because you just, I think, by the way, you explained burnout perfectly. Emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and everything's a failure, right? I mean,
Yep.
that's
Yep.
classic burnout. And so how then, and Kristen, back to you. So here's some strategies he kind of gave. What are some things that maybe you would encourage pastors to say, how do they get a hobby? How do they discover who they are outside of the ministry?
Well, this is an exercise that I actually do with pastors' wives often, or even like I get brought into like moms groups all the time, and I make them list characteristics about who they are, and they're not allowed to put a role. So, like, you're not allowed to put pastor. I'm not allowed to put wife. I'm not allowed to put mom, because those are roles that I play. Yes, they're part of me, but they're not who I am. They're a role, part of me. And so once I take that away, I have a lot of like deer in the headlight kind of moments with people where they're looking at me and really looking at, okay, who are you? And who has God made you to be? And sometimes that means you have to actually call trusted people, like hopefully, parents, siblings, maybe childhood friends, things like that. Sometimes you need their input if you're really trying to work on this. In finding hobbies and things like that, I truly believe the older we get, we lose younger versions of ourselves. And so go back and spend some time. I know it sounds weird, but maybe you even have to close your eyes and call up like little Kristin or teenage Kristin or college Kristin. And heck, sit them around a little conference table or in a little made up living room and be like, okay, guys, I feel like I've lost you. I'm sorry for that. But like in each of those phases, you had interests. You had things that you enjoyed doing. You had things that, like I said before, like filled you up, gave you energy. What are some of those things we forget and we drop past interests and hobbies and things that passions that just get buried? Well, we need to like unearth some of those and go back and reharness some of those. An example I have is actually with an eating disorder client. I do some parts work, so those younger versions of themselves. Like once we got past the eating disorder, which is an unhealthy way to deal with stress and trauma and things like that. Okay, so if we don't use an eating disorder to deal with it, I'm really simplifying things.
Right.
What are some things that we can do instead? And she remembered as a kid, young, she loved horses. She loved being around them. She loved riding them. When she was around horses, she remembered like her whole body would just, well, when she was a kid, they moved into a city and she didn't get to be around horses for like decades. She'd even kind of forgotten about it. Well, she reattached to that and she started volunteering, at the riding places, that do ministry and work with PTSD and all that kind of stuff. And it opened up and brought back this whole passion. And guess what? That was a huge tool in part of her recovery, also in living free of an eating disorder. And so it sometimes it means going back and kind of getting in touch with those parts of yourself, those former versions of yourself that just got buried. And like they hold a lot of wisdom, even the little ones. Maybe you need to pick up a coloring book. You know,
Well,
they make
have
adult coloring books now.
Yeah, exactly. I was just saying that, it's okay.
Yeah.
Just careful by what you think of an adult coloring book. I mean,
Yeah, that's
No.
true. Let's preface that.
Yeah, be careful when you Google that. So,
goodness gracious.
Yes.
See how I'm doing as a human being.